We are led by a uniquely unfit individual, I think, to deal with a time of crisis.
Inaction is a choice.
Miliband maybe is a bigger threat to us than the Millers at the moment.
What we're seeing here is the BBC potentially sort of learning the wrong lessons of the scandals of recent years.
Integration and, cultural sharing doesn't have to mean just levelling everything out to some sort of boring indistinction.
Hello and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And it's been far too long, Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
We've got loads to discuss today. We'll be talking about Starmer's flailing response to the Iran crisis, the BBC's sacking of Scott Mills, and the woke war on dogs. But before we get into all that, Tom, do you want to remind the viewers and listeners about the Spike Summit?
Yes, this is your weekly reminder about the Spike Summit, our biggest event ever on Saturday, the 27th of June, bringing together all of our favourite thinkers and writers and politicians to talk about the big issues of our time. Lionel Shriver is going to be there, Catherine Burwell-Singh is going to be there, our own Brendan O'Neill, Constantine Kissin and many more. So if you haven't got your tickets yet, make sure you grab them while we still have some. Go over to spikes-online.com/events or just click on any of the adverts for the summit on the website to get your tickets. Also, if you're a Spike supporter, you get a very healthy discount, so make sure you make use of that. And if you're not already a Spike supporter, words to the wise, you'd sign up for £5 a month. You can even do it for just 1 month. Get that discount, come to the summit and have a very good time. So yeah, spikes-online.com/events for the summit. See you there.
So the Iran war has sparked a major energy crisis across the world. The Strait of Hormuz, which basically 20% of the world's oil transport is transported through, has been closed. Energy bills are going up. The head of the International Energy Agency has said this crisis could be worse than the Ukraine gas crisis and the oil crises of the 1970s combined. So people will have been on tenterhooks when Keir Starmer addressed the nation earlier this week to announce what the government is going to be doing about this. And it turns out he is basically going to monitor the situation, not very much. Tom, what have you made of this? It seems like, we are really heading for a major crisis, and yet the government is twiddling its thumbs. It wasn't prepared for this at the start and still doesn't know how to react.
No, I mean, we've been used to sort of denials in politics. This is like the non-announcement. I mean, from what I gather, it was already sort of in the diaries for this week anyway, long before the war kicked off, an opportunity for him to take a victory lap over the hike in the minimum wage and the lifting of the two-child benefit cap, two things which he cited as proof that we were better protected against this potential crisis. Then he just announced again another kind of series of measures which were already in place, things like the fact that the postponed hike in fuel duty is going to stay postponed until September. Again, so we had non-announcement, things that had already been in the pipeline. And when it comes to actually the conflict itself, he said he was going to have a meeting about opening the Strait of Hormuz with all of the other potential partners there. So this is Keir Starmer summed up, a man who brings a meeting agenda to a knife fight. And I don't think anyone is even vaguely reassured by what it is that he's saying. And also it's increasingly telling that on the one hand, it's becoming clear that despite his reassurances, we are in some respects uniquely exposed to this crisis. We've had both the IMF and the OECD say as much in recent days because of our energy market as well as various other economic factors. And also that other countries are making the step towards more emergency measures. Even Australia, under Anthony Albanese, kind of close ally of Keir Starmer, has already halved fuel taxes in a way that Starmer is holding off from doing now. So yeah, the gap between the kind of keep calm and carry on rhetoric and what is actually happening is pretty telling. And as ever, reminded of the fact that we are led by a uniquely unfit individual, I think, to deal with a time of crisis and a need for nimble and radical thinking. Those are things that have never been associated with our Prime Minister. Absolutely.
Yeah, meetings. There's been so many meetings. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has been, having summits with energy bosses, with supermarket bosses, and, any sort of sector of industry that might be affected by the crisis, and yet nothing seems to get announced. I think someone described her as having more summits than the Himalayas. Ella, what have you made of this sort of, non-reaction to this massive emergency?
Yeah, well, if you read what Starmer said, I mean, a lot of it is him trying to sound sensible. So he says, it's going to be tough, and there's going a storm ahead, and all this, like purposefully sort of saying, I'm not lying to you here, I'm going to be gloomy, like things aren't good. but with no, I think actually with no real honesty as to why things aren't going to be good. So there are choices on the table. The Tories have suggested that you could cut green levies. That's one option. You could cut taxes. You could do something about the price cap coming to an end in July. There are things that there are options on the table. The government is choosing not to do them. So I think the rhetoric coming out of number 10 is there's nothing really we can do here. And you made a good point in your article on this, Fraser, that whatever happened, there is going to be some negative effect because of Iran. Nobody's denying that. But the idea that the only option is for us to sit and wait and see what happens is ridiculous. Inaction is a choice. But on the other hand, there's been a lot of commentary around this to say, why isn't he putting in place emergency measures? It's so unfair. People are going to be put into poverty, all the rest of it, and the households are going to be hit in relation to this. And my husband's freaking out every time someone runs the chipper for too long because of fuel prices. People are feeling this. But the idea that government's only response would be to do nothing and then just give people more money is also a failure. What really needs to happen, as we've said many times on Spiked, is a much broader look at the long-term picture. So just like what I would do if I was Prime Minister tomorrow, sack Ed Miliband and just completely get rid of his ideological grip on any decision in relation to energy. Look again at North Sea, look again at drilling, all of these things which, you've had some really petty interactions from politicians in the last sort of week or so who say, well, it wouldn't do anything for bills. How ridiculous of you to be talking about the North Sea, completely neglecting the fact that it, yes, it wouldn't change things tomorrow.
Yeah.
But if we're ever going to have a different approach than just sort of holding our hands up when these crises happen, and more of them are going to happen in the future. Iran is not the last international crisis we're going to see. You have to make some quite big ideological shifts in relation to net zero and green levies and all the rest of it, which we know the government is fundamentally opposed to. So there's, the options are there on the table. Most of us know what would actually change something. The government is choosing not to do that. So this is not something that's just happening to us that we have to sort of weather the storm. This is a choice by the government to impoverish us.
Yeah, and I think, on that front, it is, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that as far as the UK is concerned alone, Miliband maybe is a bigger threat to us than the Mullahs at the moment. We already have, even before the Iran crisis, we had the highest energy bills in the developed world. And they are just committed to policies that will keep making them higher. And it's worth debunking some of the points that the government is coming out with, because they'll say, well, it won't make any difference to bills because there is a global gas price. I mean, it's true there's a European market for gas, so it might not make as much of a difference as it would if we were just selling gas to ourselves. But that also neglects a lot of things. Gas has to be transported, so that adds to the cost. So there's a preference, industry would rather sell to the UK if it's extracted here. There's also fracking, which hasn't even been discussed. The government hasn't even hasn't even rebutted the idea of fracking. They're just talking about not drilling in the North Sea. There's all kinds of options that could be explored. And as you said, maybe it won't, reduce your bill tomorrow, but what about the next crisis? This is the second energy crisis in 4 years. So this is not, a completely black swan event.
And also, a lot of the policies that we're talking about, kind of junking net zero, these would be good ideas in peacetime. So it's not as if we're talking about taking drastic measures which could have serious kind of fiscal impacts in the near term. You're talking about things which they should have been doing anyway, or stop doing things that they've been doing for a very long time. You could very strongly make the argument that Ed Miliband runs the country now at the moment as well. Not only is the Labour government holding on to its net zero policies, even as you're starting to hear certain murmurs from Rachel Reeves and other parts of the government about maybe we need to rethink the North Sea and so on and so forth. It shows how much sway he has over a very weak and Starmer administration. It was telling that the reporting around the initial kind of prevarication over allowing the Americans to use the air bases, it was actually Ed Miliband, as well as a few others, who were pushing back on Keir Starmer, who was originally quite open to them being used for the supposedly defensive measures. And also, as it goes for energy policy, so Ed Miliband has been running the show for decades now. I mean, the Climate Change Act, if memory serves, at the sort of tail end, the dog days of the Brown government, was something that he had a role in shepherding through government, and is something which, through Parliament rather, and the broad outlines of that have been followed by the political class ever since. You would think that a man who has 2 kitchens would be a bit more sensitive to energy price fluctuations, but apparently not. And it just shows the power of ideology that all of this stuff has managed, seemingly, at least where the centre-left is concerned, looks like all these green fantasies are going to survive 2 huge wars with enormous energy implications, and yet still they will be mouthing these platitudes and these fantasies even as everything kind of goes up in flames all around them.
The thing to really, if there's one thing I could praise Keir Starmer on, which is as of yet he hasn't gone down the road of sort of the working from home route, which European Union and others have announced. I can feel it coming.
The energy lockdown.
I just think that it's just worth mentioning how remarkable that is. That, you know, that you would have a serious response to an energy crisis being the sort of COVID lockdown mentality of, what shall we tell people who can't afford to heat, you know, have a bath or turn on the heating, you know, do less. That is this. It's just so perfectly encapsulates the miserabilism and the low horizons of politics today. I was stunned that's the response. And I think we need to really watch whether or not our government goes down. It feels like they might be moving towards that. And if they do, we should just not take that, because that is a crazy admission of failure.
Absolutely. Let's talk about another failure. The BBC is in crisis again over Scott Mills. We learned this week that allegations had led to a police investigation. Now, the initial allegations date back to over 25 years ago. The police investigation was itself 10 years ago. But Scott Mills, the Radio 2 presenter, was sort of sacked unceremoniously. There wasn't even, you know, it's like kind of unusual because usually there's a sort of long media campaign that precedes the sacking, and you usually get the BBC clings on until the person can't stay on anymore. This time it was the opposite. They seem to have sacked him first, asked questions later, and you know, this sets quite a worrying precedent, doesn't it, Tom?
It does, and I think what we're seeing here is the BBC potentially sort of learning the wrong lessons of the scandals of recent years, because there have clearly been situations in which they've clung on to people far longer than they should have. Hugh Edwards is a good example. They were kind of continuing to, if not go out to bat for him, then certainly kind of slow walking any kind of action, even when before we knew about the full extent of the crimes he had committed in relation to child pornography, that just the internal reports about his behaviour were kind of mounting up and up and up. And to be honest, we don't really even still know the full extent of that. And yet he was still on the payroll. There was still, again, these kind of long, dawdling investigations taking place. And what we see here is, we don't know, but looks like it could well be a sort of overcorrection. The BBC seems to either underreact or overreact. It doesn't have any gear in between those two things. And so now we're in a situation where all we know is that there was this police interview in 2016, that nothing went any further than that. There was no charge, there was no prosecution. So far, this is essentially an allegation alone, which is resurfaced via reporting in the Daily Mirror and elsewhere. And off the back of this, he was summarily sacked. And when you think about the way in which the kind of post-Savile moment ripped through a lot of particularly kind of former BBC people, and it very quickly became clear that a lot of these allegations, not all of them, but a hell of a lot of them, were made out of whole cloth, pushed by fantasists, the kind of Carl Beaches of this world. You would think that they would recognise that's a grim road to go down. So, but you go back to that original point, there's so much that we don't know, which makes it very difficult to comment about this, but also very difficult to therefore justify the way that the BBC have acted so swiftly in a way that has left many people's heads spinning within the BBC and even outside of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was reportedly an audible gasp at the BBC, you know, when everyone got their email announcing Scott Mills has been sacked, because he's someone who's been there for, you know, he's not a household name, I suppose, in the way that Hugh Edwards is, but he's been there for, you know, decades and decades. He's a BBC lifer, really. And there hadn't been, it seems, the kind of rumours swirling around. No one had a bad word to say about him, that kind of thing. So it did come as a bit of a shock. And yeah, Ella, I mean, we're in a dangerous place, aren't we? If a police interview where there is, you know, the police explicitly say we don't have enough evidence to take this to court, to go to a prosecution, where that is treated as proof of a crime. Again, there may be many more things we don't know. There may be non-criminal aspects to this. That's not the only, it's not just crimes that lead to people's sackings, but still, if that's the case, then we're in a very dangerous place.
Yeah, Luke Gittos has written a really great article for Spiked about this, where he just reminds people of the importance of the presumption of innocence and really helpfully spells out, if you don't know that much about, law and what happens when you get interviewed by the police, read Luke's articles, because he says, look, it's completely possible that someone makes a false allegation against you, you get interviewed by the police, and everything gets called off because there's not enough evidence, or something to that effect.
And it doesn't have to be that doesn't have to be malicious necessarily.
No,
it could be a mistake. It could be,
it could be anything. It could be anything until you have concrete evidence of a charge or something like that, or things being taken further. We don't know. And there's two competing narratives here. There's the no smoke without fire narrative, which seems to be what we're living by now, which is, if there's a bit of like rumor around your name, action has to be taken. That's in direct conflict with the presumption of innocence, which is fundamental to our justice system and our sense of right and wrong. And you can whatever people make their own judgments about someone like Scott Mills, you might what you make your own judgments about it, but what the action an institution like the BBC takes is important in the abstract, because there'll be lots of people working for the BBC who who knows, might have been interviewed by the police for shoplifting when they were young or something or whatever, and think, hang on a minute, is my job so tenuous? And looking at the timeline of the Scott Mills thing is really interesting, because the BBC knew about the questioning by the police, but it wasn't until the journalist who had heard these rumours basically came to the BBC and said, you seem to not have done anything about this, that the BBC suddenly thought, oh my God, it's going to be Hugh Edwards again, we're going to get shamed and framed for this, quick, sack him. So it seems to be a kind of exercise in BBC backside covering rather than a thought out moral judgment on an individual. So it's a real mess, but defending the presumption of innocence, I think, is more important than being the first one who says, haha, I denounced him first. And actually Luke makes a point of saying that there has been quite a good reaction to this. There have been other journalists who've said, hang on a minute, this all seems a bit rash.
Just on the broader question of the BBC, Tom, can the BBC get anything right? I mean, we're about to get a new Director General after the last one resigned over the atrocious editing of that Panorama documentary that implied that Trump was, ginning up riots. We had those reports come out last year alleging all kinds of bias on the trans issue, on Gaza. It's right that people are focusing on their sort of HR procedures in relation to the Scott Mills story, but it seems that even just editorially, they are lost as an institution.
Yeah, and I think that makes it much more difficult for them to weather these storms and also to make any decision with any degree of clarity, coherence. They're clearly just rattling from one often self-made scandal to another, and the context of this is declining public trust in the institution, or just sense of its worth as well. I think that's the other thing. So you put all those things together, and it's going to make them even, or it's made them even more sort of erratic in their decision making. And it seems, as we say, we don't know the details of the particular case yet, but in that context, it's very easy to see, shall we say, that more people will just be thrown under the bus entirely unnecessarily, which is disheartening, because of the fact that over the past 10 years, Me Too, Operation Newtree, all the rest of it, it should have served as a very helpful reminder to polite society that sometimes allegations are false. That is just a simple truth. You don't have to go around disbelieving absolutely anyone and everyone who makes a accusation, whether it's historical or otherwise. To recognise that, you would think everyone would have learned from the Carl Beach situation. Someone who's now serving, I think, somewhere in the region of 17 or 18 years in prison for perverting the course of justice, and for a series of child sex offences as well, who was the key accuser at the heart of the VIP paedophile scandal, which turned to be something that was completely made up in his own head. Harvey Procter, various Tory politicians were swept up in that. This was uncritically promoted by various sections of the media, his claims, that is. and yet it turned out to be put about by someone who wasn't just untrustworthy, but himself a child abuser. So you would think that lesson had been learned, but obviously not with the current evidence, unless we learn something, some new bombshell was about to hit, and that's not good for institutions either. Like the way in which they could so easily fall prey to bouts of hysteria, in effect, and also I think the broader context here is exactly as you say, is that it's almost difficult for them to make any decision because people just don't have much trust at all in whatever direction they might go with things like this.
Absolutely. Should we talk about the war on dogs? Also sparked by the BBC. A BBC video report has gone viral, which asks, are we becoming too dog-friendly as a country? BBC Wales has also produced an article where it interviewed various people who have fears of dogs. So they say they can't go out in public because there's too many dogs everywhere. There's dogs in all the cafes, there's dogs in all the parks, there's dogs wherever you go. Now, I think people are right to raise an eyebrow at this, because it was only recently where the actual British government, via DEFRA, put out a report saying that the countryside is too white, and one way to diversify it would be to have fewer dogs, because there's a certain religion that doesn't take kindly to dogs. They never spell this out explicitly, but we all know what it's about. The Welsh government as well, one of their reports into as part of becoming an anti-racist country by 2030 says we need fewer dogs out of respect for Muslims. I mean, we don't know that the BBC was necessarily thinking about Muslims, but it was quite interesting that they didn't mention it at all. The absence, it told its own story in a way. Tom, what have you made of it?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be framed largely around kind of people who are scared of dogs and sort of hypochondria more broadly. But this has come up before. I mean, I remember when DEFRA launched that plan to make the countryside more inclusive, it was being talked up even by sort of Labour outriders as something which would be to encourage more Muslims to go to the countryside. So that was, I guess, part of the subplot there. So it's a kind of heady mixture of the preoccupations of polite society, I suppose, one of which is supposed inclusion, even at the cost of things that the majority of the population actually hold quite keenly to in relation to animals and dogs in particular. And also just the willingness to indulge neuroticism and reshape society around that. So I think with the dogs question, you've got those two things crashing together.
Yeah, Ella, what you've made it. You're not keen on dogs, are you?
I'm with you, brothers. Ban the dogs. I hate dogs. I hate dog people. But
there's everyone switching off.
Conscious of the fact that that will make me both unpopular and, there's not many people who are like that with me. I mean, I live in Hackney, so
London has become a bit too dog friendly, I think. This is not the countryside.
It's also the wrong kind of dogs. Yeah. It's like little yappy dogs, not.
Get a proper dog.
For a whole other podcast, I think we do have a problem with the blurring between animals and humans, particularly in Hackney cafes. But the fact that if you the sort of English pastoral countryside thing that the DEFRA and government is attacking as uninclusive, has an identity. It's the sort of dog walking, out in the fields thing that people in this country like, and very much, this Englishman's home is his castle with a dog by his side. It's part of English identity. Dogs are and have been for a long time. And the idea that would have to change to be inclusive is ridiculous. And it's also, I mean, these things can be confected. That it's not necessary. I just don't actually believe that it's true that Muslim families' number one desire to, the thing that's stopping them from going to the Lake District is dogs everywhere. Yeah. I just don't think that's true. I think it's a sort of fever dream of often the often white campaigners in DEFRA also that are trying to find ways to either make headlines or make work for themselves. But I think, even despite my absolute genuine hatred for dogs, I mean, really, really, really hate them, I would defend people's right to walk them if it's a case of refusing to be inclusive. We don't have to be inclusive all the time.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It does seem to be you can almost pluck any pastime or hobby or something people enjoy out of the air and say, well, that's got to change because white English people like it. You think about the English or British flag. It's the most inoffensive thing in the world, but the wrong kind of people wave it, so we better tear them all down and replace them with the rainbow flags or Palestine flags or something.
Especially where multiculturalism is concerned, I think what this is an example of is the narrative is that the majority have to give certain things up, even if they hold them quite dearly, in order to accommodate, or at least in the minds of the officials and the mandarins drawing up these paternalistic policies, the newcomers. And that's something which seems almost designed to gin up sense of anger, and with the policies and a sense of genuine division. And it's interesting, I think we talked about this last time, the perennial is the countryside racist debate flared up. It seems to be at least every 6 weeks now. Is that the language has shifted as well in a way that seems really divisive, because it's not even a kind of over-the-top discussion about how the countryside is actually really discriminatory in XYZ fashion and those barriers should be removed, often probably vastly exaggerating such barriers. I mean, there's many quite prosaic reasons why ethnic minorities don't tend to go to the countryside. Most of them live in cities, for example, and tend to go back to their countries of origin when they've got a bit of time and money to go on holiday. There's some quite obvious reasons why that's the case, rather than them just being terrified by either the locals or their canine companions as soon as they show up. So you've got that, but then the language has now become, it's not that the countryside is even racist or discriminatory, or it's that it's too white. That again is an interesting sort of linguistic shift that we've seen, which seems almost designed to cause a backlash and to look quite unpleasant.
Yeah, and I agree with your point, Ella, that I don't believe that there is actually a huge demand from ordinary Muslims, maybe some wacko Islamists, to get rid of dogs, and in the same way that actually most ethnic minority people are not terrified of the British flag. It is the woke civil servants in Whitehall or in the local council or whatever who think the British flag is disgraceful, whereas actually minorities most of the time actually would probably quite like to live in a country that has a sense of itself, that's patriotic. There's a reason people come to the UK, because they like a lot of the customs and way of life here and traditions
and things that I'm thinking about what sort of unique Morris dancing comes to mind. Something like that, which you might countryside weird Ignish tradition. The idea that these things should be made more inclusive would like sap them of all their uniqueness and interest. There's this sort of like very sort of beige approach to culture that's just everything has to be leveled out so that it's and inclusive to me basically ends up sounding like boring, like it's lost any of its uniqueness, or the idea that you would have to be able to enjoy a tradition, you would have to be able to like participate in it rather than being a spectator. The idea that you'd have to like decolonize Morris dancing or make the countryside dog free so that Muslims could go. Any of this it's just such a silly response to inclusion. Inclusion doesn't have to, genuine inclusion and integration and cultural sharing doesn't have to mean just leveling everything out to some sort of a boring indistinction.
Yeah, and I don't know if Morris dancing's been decolonized yet, but the BBC certainly has done a lot of coverage to the non-binary and trans-inclusive Morris dancing troops. So, keep paying your license fee.
I also hate Morris dancing. FYI, so, yeah.
I think, I'm not sure there's many fans of it left. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ella. Thank you to everyone at home. But that is not it. We're about to go over to Spiked Podcast Unlocked, where we'll be discussing the Clapham TikTok riots, Andrew Garfield's nasty swipe at J.K. Rowling, and whether being a parent makes you happy. So, see you there. Spike Podcast Unlocked is exclusive for Spike supporters. So if you're not yet a supporter, then sign up now for just £5 a month and you will get unlimited access to Spike. Just go to spiked-online.com/support. Thank you so much for watching the Spike Podcast. We'll be back next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the Spike Podcast, then why not check out what else our channel has to offer, from our documentaries to our weekly interviews and podcasts like The Brendan O'Neill Show. And if you're a Spike supporter, you can watch the second half of this episode by logging in on the Spiked website. If you're not yet a Spike supporter, then why not sign up now? You'll get unlimited access to the website, ad-free reading, discounted tickets to our events, and so much more. So, become a Spike supporter today by going to spiked-online.com/support. That's spiked-online.com/support.